Hello, welcome back to the workout of the week with Escape Fitness. My name's Tommy Matthews, this is Andy Phillips, who's going to be demonstrating our exercises today with the new CMT. This is a core momentum trainer. Core momentum trainer is designed with steel shot within the casing, and what the steel shot does is moves and produces essentially a sort of like a ricochet or an aftershock effect in movement patterns. So what it does at the end of range is quite interesting. A couple of key things, and what we're going to look at today is how it can improve range of motion, thus improving or preparing us for exercise. A bit like a movement preparation sequence. We're going to look specifically today at hip mobility in all three planes. So it's a triplanar hip mobility sequence with the CMT. It can also be very good for improving stability at end of range because of that ricochet effect. Essentially what's going to happen, it creates a bit of a sound as we're working. So as you can hear that sound, it shows us or demonstrates to us that we're moving correctly. We have to apply quite a large amount of force and move quite dynamically with the CMT to create that sound. So with that forceful movement or that dynamic movement, we then really push ourselves into that end of range, and then we have to work hard to stabilize and control in that position. So with the triplanar hip movement, it's important that Andy, who's going to demonstrate these exercises, is going to set himself up correctly with the CMT. There's a safety catch on the end. We've got to make sure that every time we're using the CMT, we always use that safety catch. Okay? Once we've correctly set ourselves up, with the hip mobility, we're going to work in the sagittal plane first. So the sagittal plane setup, we're going to have our feet facing straight forwards, and this is a focused movement on the hip area. So we're not looking at a gross movement across the whole body. Okay, so all we're going to be thinking about is driving the hip forwards. And he's just going to start performing a few now. Okay, so now you've seen the movement, what you'll notice is that Andy sets up on the first side. Stance first of all, feet are facing straight forwards. Hip is driving forwards as the CMT is coming over the head. So Andy's just going to finish in that top position. You'll notice how the hip is driving forwards. In this position, we want to make sure that the glutes are really switched on this left side. Okay, so that's going to support our pelvis and make sure that we're opening up our hip correctly through the sagittal plane. So essentially what you probably will feel is a bit of a stretch through the hip flexors, through the front of the hip. You'll notice that the noise actually happens as the CMT is coming over the head, and that final little movement at the top is where it's really going to help us get to end of range through the hip joint. So Andy's just going to perform a few more so we can see that sound. Now essentially the steel shot is amplifying the weight. Although that's only 1 kilo of weight, when it creates that acceleration and moves quickly through the casing, it makes that weight a lot greater. So it almost doubles it, if not triples it, depending on the speed that we're moving at. So that's the first one. That's in our sagittal plane. What we're going to look at now is through the frontal plane. With the frontal plane movement, it's the same setup position. We're focusing on the left hip first of all. The arm's going to be straight up above the head, and Andy's just going to perform this movement. It's essentially a lateral hip driver. So we're going to just bend the back knee a little bit so we can get a real focus through the lateral side of the hip. Okay, and this is the left side, so off you go. Perform a few for us, Andy. Okay, so switch over just quickly there. Again, feet are facing straight forwards. Perfect. Okay, get back to the first position for us there, Andy. Essentially what we're doing here in the staggered stance setup with a bent knee is really focusing on lateral hip movement. Okay, so with the arms up above the head, what the CMT is going to do is Andy drives his hip out to the left. The CMT and the weight is going to pull us over to the opposite side. Okay, so that's really going to open up through the lateral aspect of the hip, thus improving the mobility through that plane of motion. And obviously we're going to do that on both sides. Again, that sound is really important, and that steel shot within the CMT is going to really pull us and drive us into that end of range through the lateral side of the hip complex. Okay, the final one we're going to do is work through the transverse plane. So same staggered stance position. Okay. With the stagger stance position, what we're going to be doing is taking the CMT down across the hip and bringing it up across the body. As we do this, we're going to be really focusing on rotation through the hip and opening up the hip complex in the transverse plane. So Andy's just going to demonstrate a couple now. Excellent stuff. Same on the other side. You'll notice that we've got the bottom hand over and the top hand under. Awesome. Back to the start. So with this movement pattern, essentially what you'll see is Andy's performing this really nicely. He's got good hip mobility anyway, but what we're doing here is we're focusing on driving the hip forward, and as the CMT is taking us round to the side, that's bringing us into rotation through the hip. We're going to have to be soft through the knee, and we're going to allow our hip to actually turn into that movement. And again, it's the steel shot that's going to pull us into that rotation through the end. So what you'll be feeling is opening up through the hip, through the front, and hopefully the rotational aspect of this movement will develop that transverse mobility within the hip complex. It's again important to have our foot stance just facing straight forwards for this one. However, if you want to, you can actually start playing with your foot stance by turning it out or turning it in, and that's going to develop slightly differently or place different stresses through the hip joint as we're performing the movement. So it's really important with the CMT as a product that we make sure that we're looking at that sound. If you get the sound right, you know you're getting the movement right. You have to move quite quickly with it, and it's also quite important to make sure that to start off with, you start off with some basic movements. These movements are generally fairly basic, but we've also got to make sure that when we are working through the hip that we're really focusing on glute activation, so we're not stressing through the lumbar spine in any way. Okay? What you'll probably find with the CMT that it also activates and recruits a lot of inner unit muscles, so the core musculature, which is also a great thing for movement preparation. So that was a little introduction to the CMT for hip mobility and how it can improve triplanar hip mobility. Have a go with that at some point. It's a great thing to do for movement preparation before maybe a squatting session or a lower body exercise session, maybe in your lunges or deadlifts. We hope you enjoy that one, and let us know how you get on.